Hi everyone, Michelle here to talk to you today about hydration specifically. Little background on myself first. Name is Michelle. I'm a sports dietitian. So I worked in Major League Soccer for about 4 or 5 years. I was with Real Salt Lake, the MLS team in Utah for 4 years, and then Seattle Sounders for the past season. And now I'm fully with a company called Zone In, which is actually an athlete's app for them to use to help them fuel properly and learn about nutrition. So quick little brief background on myself before we kind of dig into hydration here. So, to start off with, of course, there's lots of different things that go into hydration, many different variables that play into individualized hydration. But hopefully, today you're going to learn a little bit about some of the big picture points and some take home points as well that you can use with your athletes. So, you'll see here we're going to cover the body and water within it. How do we lose water? What's the importance of hydration? And then, of course, some take home practical tips as well. So, looking first and foremost at the body and water, you can see the body is made up of anywhere from 60 to 70% water, just showing how essential it is. Many of the different tissues here are listed out, how much water is contained in each of those. So, again, just showing the importance of water in the body. Furthermore, you can see here at the bottom, athletes' muscles are made up of about 75% water versus adipose or fat tissue, which is about 10%. So, that shows most athletes, generally speaking, have higher muscle content, showing that they have those increased needs as well for water. So keeping that in mind with an athletic population versus maybe a general population. So looking at functions of water within the body, you can see here all listed out things like cardiovascular function. It helps with lubrication of different tissues and cells within the body. It aids with digestion, absorption of nutrients, excretion of very different products out of the body as well. Transport of oxygen and nutrients to our brain and our muscles helps, of course, regulate body temperature, blood volume, blood pressure regulation. So all of these different things, of course, are going to play into performance, right? Something I do like to note, you can see at the bottom here, water does not provide energy. So it's not like one of our macronutrients like carbs, protein, or fat, where we're going to be pulling energy from it. Rather, it's going to be doing these types of functions within the body. So, looking at how do we gain and how do we lose water, right? So, of course, through our food, which some people don't think about. So, very high water content foods are going to contribute to our intake of water. Same with any type of beverages, whether that's water, milk, tea, etc. Anything like that, of course, going to increase our water intake. And then same with metabolism. So it's actually an end product of carbohydrate metabolism, resulting in ATP and water. So one of the smaller contributions, but it's there. How about how do we lose water? That's something we tend to think about more, especially when it comes to dehydration. So, of course, most obvious that we think of is through the skin with our sweat is one way we're going to lose it. Of course, through waste. So urine, feces is also going to be a loss of water. And then a least common thought of one is respiration. So if you think about when it's cold out, you can see your breath, right? We are losing water as we breathe as well. So again, coming back to that athletic population, if we think about all those ways we're losing it, they're going to also have those increased losses as well. So now let's talk a little bit more about water loss and how that's going to be impacting us and what impacts how quickly we lose water. You can see here different ways. So training intensity and duration, of course, the longer and the harder it is, the more we're likely going to be losing. Movement velocity, so with sweat on our skin, depending upon how fast we're moving, what the wind speeds are, the environment, which we can see here, that's all going to play into water loss. Same with humidity, air motion, temperatures in general. Of course, the warmer and more humid, the more we're tending to sweat and lose that water. Travel. So when you're on flight, you actually lose more water. So a lot of times with my athletes, it's really emphasizing when we're traveling, making sure we're hydrating. Clothing and equipment. So of course, if you have more equipment and clothing on, typically we're going to be losing more water. So again, something to keep in mind based on the sport you're coaching, the athletes you're working with, how much equipment and clothing they're going to have on. Genetics plays a huge role, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Acclimatization. So how long have they been in that environment? How has their body adapted to that? And training status as well. So all of these things are going to impact, of course, water loss. So let's talk a little bit about what we like to call sweat rate. So this is something very individualized. You've probably noticed that some of your athletes in the same conditions, maybe the same equipment, are going to be losing sweat at different rates. Some are drenched and others are barely sweating. So this is, like we were just talking about, a very individualized thing. Sweat rate can come down to mainly genetics. So this is where it can be kind of hard sometimes to recommend, certain amounts during certain times because everyone is so variable. So it's kind of learning what their sweat rate is, how often they're sweating, whether they're really heavy sweater or maybe not as much. But we can pull some averages, right? So average losses, you can see here, can be anywhere from 1 to 3 liters per hour, which is a pretty significant amount if you think about it, anywhere from 4 to 12 cups. And same with salt or sodium, which we'll talk about in just a moment. You can see anywhere from 3.9 to 6.1 grams per hour, or a whole teaspoon of salt can be lost in the sweat. So that's something else that will be important to replace outside of just water, which again, we'll talk about in a moment. So here you can see an example like soccer. They can lose anywhere from 0.4 to 3.5% change in body weight within a training session, which for that can be up to 5 pounds of water loss. And I've heard up to, especially in like some NFL athletes, anywhere from 10 to 15 pounds can be lost in one training session. So that's a significant amount of water weight that, of course, has to be replaced. So something really important to keep in mind. Furthermore, you can see here, this is just a rough graph of different types of sweat rates, normative data by sport, just so you can kind of get a better idea of, okay, maybe within sport differences, but here you can see some average losses as well. So then moving into sweat composition, because when we think about hydration and sweat, a lot of time we think about water, right? But our sweat isn't just water. We have what we call electrolytes within those, which I'm sure you're all pretty familiar with. But electrolytes are really important for that fluid balance. So when we're taking in water, keeping that water in and keeping balance going, muscle function, signals within the nervous system, being able to fire muscles, cognitive function, etc. So electrolytes are another important thing to think about replacing when it comes to hydration. Various electrolytes within sweat. Mainly what we like to focus on is the sodium because that is the largest proponent of sweat. So you can see here that we have sodium, we have chloride, potassium, magnesium, calcium. We are losing all of those through our sweat, but mainly wanting to really think and focus on sodium. So I have some food sources listed here of each of those. Looking at sodium specifically, you can see things, of course, that are salted like nuts, trail mix, pretzels, crackers, typical table salt. Of course, a lot of your sports drinks are going to include sodium in them. So just keeping that in mind with hydration of, okay, how are we getting our sodium as well to help replace that with our sweat loss? Furthermore, again, how much sodium you lose in your sweat is also very different depending upon the individual and their genetics. So a lot of times in different team sports, we'll do testing around that. But here again is kind of some rough estimates by sport of how much sodium are they potentially losing in their sweat as well. So now let's look at hydration in general and why is it important to hydrate? Of course, all the stuff we went over with body functions, water functions within the body are all important reasons why. So again, kind of going back to that cardiovascular function, body temperature regulation, substrate utilization, all of those things are going to impact performance. So of course, it's going to be super important to make sure we're hydrating throughout our training sessions, our games, etc. So looking at dehydration, signs and symptoms, I'm sure you're all very familiar with these, but just again, to kind of reiterate here, you can see signs and symptoms of dehydration, whether it's thirst, fatigue, headache, high rates of perceived exertion, irregular high heart rates, lack of concentration, they're feeling weak, irritable, maybe they're confused and disoriented, nausea, vomiting. Also decreased sweat. So if you know that typically they are a pretty heavy sweater or they just sweat in general, and all of a sudden they're not sweating at all, that could also be a red flag there of dehydration. Furthermore, of course, urine color can be used, somewhat subjective. This is a nice little chart here that you can kind of look at. But important to keep in mind, urine color can also be impacted by other things. So you can see here I have listed high protein intakes can sometimes make it darker. Certain foods such as beets, berries, and asparagus can really kind of darken the color as well as riboflavin or a B vitamin in a lot of sports drinks. So keeping that in mind, again, it can be a great subjective measure and something that's easy for athletes to resonate with, but there are things that will, of course, always impact it as well. Okay, looking at what certain times when hydration is even more critical. Of course, always important, but thinking about these things like 2 days trainings, really having to replace in between those sessions, especially I feel like a lot of the 2 days are happening in summer for some sports. So it's kind of a double whammy then. During tournaments, of course, because you're playing all day long, high competition, Warm weather, as I mentioned, travel, a lot of people don't realize, but you are getting pretty dehydrated during travel. So making sure you're replacing it, whether it's on a bus, a plane, etc. Training at altitude can increase needs. Of course, just hard training sessions. Illness, something you don't think about a lot, maybe as making sure as coaches, making sure you're really advocating if there is an athlete who is going through an illness to make sure they're hydrating well. And of course, heat and humidity. So playing back into that environmental factor. So let's talk a little bit about dehydration and performance. So as you can see here, as little as a 2% change in body weight can impact performance. And with those examples that we previously went over with, you can see anywhere from 0.5% up to 3.5% for an average soccer player is lost. So that's a pretty normal thing to see. So we have to make sure we're fighting against that. With this 2% change in in water loss, we're seeing an increased rate in body temp. So of course that can help, or that's going to lead to things like heat exhaustion, potentially stroke, worst case scenario, death. But how are we with that body temp, of course, going to be impacting our performance as well. Cramping and fatigue are going to come along with that. So we're going to see an increase in all of those items, while at the same time seeing a decrease in strength, endurance, altered fuel utilization. So we're not going to be able to utilize those nutrients as well to produce energy to hopefully, of course, perform as well. And along with that, cognitive function as well. So, of course, one of the signs in dehydration was confusion, disorientation. So, not being able to be quick as our feet, cognitively not functioning as well with that dehydration starting to set in. So, again, 2% body weight might sound like, oh, that's not that much, but really it adds up quickly and can be seen, like I mentioned, very easily in many, many athletes. So, you can see at the top here, for example, a 150-pound athlete. That's as little as a 3-pound loss in weight, which we see very frequently happen with many of our athletes. So, keeping in mind, it is pretty easy to lose that water weight throughout a training session. Here at the bottom here, you can see too, it can take up to 24 hours to regain fluid balance after dehydration. So that's why it's so important to stay on top of it, which we'll talk about in a moment, both between training sessions and daily intake, especially during those critical times that we just talked about, whether it's tournaments, two-a-days, really hot days in the summer. So keeping that in mind when it comes to rehydration practices, and the same with that sodium intake and whatnot. Lastly here, just to make a note on to not rely on thirst. Of course, thirst is a great mechanism, but especially in younger athletes, they're not always in tune with that. So we'll talk about some ways to kind of help advocate for making sure they're hydrating both during training and throughout the day, but not to just rely on thirst, because a lot of time it's not going to do the job how it needs to get done. So now let's talk a little bit again about dig into some practical tips. So what are some take-home messages you can send and educate both you and your athletes, parents on, and whatnot? So, looking first and foremost, of course, schedule in water breaks during training. Don't expect your athletes to think of themselves to pull themselves off to go take a drink of water or sports drinks, whatever it might be. Really have them scheduled in so that way they're in place and it's mandated throughout the training session. Of course, advocate for consistent hydration both during those water breaks, making sure everyone does consume something, but also, again, throughout the day. We'll talk about some tips there, but you can't stress enough that it's not just around training. I always tell my athletes hydration is a 24/7 job. It's never stopping. So making sure that they're doing that consistently throughout the day, throughout the week, and then, of course, during trainings as well. Educate them the best you can on why is it important. Athletes do like to know why. And so kind of educating them on some of those things we talked about today. How is it impacting their performance? How might it hinder that? And what are some times that they really do need to focus extra on their hydration as well? Talking a little bit about pre and post weigh-ins. This is something that, of course, you don't have to utilize, but it can be a good gauge for some of your athletes of like showing them how much are you losing during a training session. With the teams I've worked with, we've of course done this in the past. It's a pretty simple way of before they go out to training, you kind of get their weight, they go out, and when they come back in, getting their post weight to see how much they lost. It could be a really big eye opener for some of them, seeing, oh my gosh, I lost 4 or 5 pounds during that training session, and having to realize that that is water weight they're losing, and that's how much they're going to have to replace now. So thinking a little bit more proactively of, I know I'm a heavy sweater, I know I'm going to lose a lot of weight during this training. How do I make sure I'm drinking throughout it so I don't get that dehydration factor? And then lastly, of course, the urine color chart, which we've gone over, and I'll show you again in just a moment, but kind of maybe putting that up in locker rooms or in stalls. So that way, again, they have that check in place and kind of keeps it on top of their mind as well. So let's look specifically at training hydration and some recommendations around that. First and foremost, before training, about 2 to 3 hours before, we like to recommend about 2 to 3 cups, drinking that slowly leading into. Again, that's kind of part of that daily routine and making sure we're always hydrating. And then 15 minutes before, having another 1 cup. Types to think about here, whether it's water, juice, sports drink, milk, all very much appropriate things to be having. Typically wanting to avoid carbonation as that doesn't sit great in the stomach, especially before training. Focusing on things like salted water, fruits, vegetables are also really great. So again, we're getting those electrolytes and that sodium within it. Things like soup or broth may be great as well. Now, looking a little bit during training, again, I know we've talked a lot about it. So, how do we make sure, again, we're hydrating throughout? So, we like to recommend about 1 cup every 15 minutes. And it's great to have some type of source of carbohydrate within that as well, especially for younger athletes. That's going to help provide that energy that our body needs to keep training and performing well. It's also going to help us retain some of that fluid. Again, trying to emphasize not to rely solely on thirst, but having those scheduled breaks within to make sure that they are hydrating throughout. Things we like to focus on are things like water, sports drinks, of course, again, avoiding those juices or carbonation, as those typically don't sit great in the GI system. And then lastly here, post, of course, super important. So typically we like to recommend 2 to 3 cups per pound loss. So again, if they are doing kind of those weigh-ins and weigh-outs once in a while, they can get a better feel for how much they should be replacing based on what they lost during training. And of course, rehydrating immediately and then continually throughout the day. It's not just like a one and done, but making sure we're continually rehydrating. Something else like we've talked about with urine color, if it's really pale or clear, making sure we're really rehydrating within that first 2 to 3 hours post training. Different types of beverages to concentrate on are things like a protein, carb, and electrolyte drink, so a good recovery beverage. So we also want to get in all of our nutrients post training to make sure we're replenishing our carb source. Refueling our muscles, all that good stuff. So things like milk or other items can be a really great recovery drink that a lot of youth athletes will enjoy. Again, thinking about things high in those electrolytes, whether it's back to those salted, watery fruit, vegetables, soups, broths, incorporating those in as well. Of course, different types of sports drinks still, but just making sure we're getting in all those different nutrients as well as hydrating as well. So, what are some tips around hydration that we can also give our athletes? So, say they don't tend to really like to drink plain water, adding things like flavor or color, whether it's some flavoring packets, some fresh berries, throwing them in, some cucumbers, whatever that might be to give it a little flavor can be really helpful as well. Making it a temperature that they enjoy, whether that's cold or room temperature. Always carrying a water bottle with them. So, to school, between classes, when they're traveling at practice, always having one in their bag with water or some type of hydration beverage within it. For salty sweaters, again, focusing on those electrolytes. So salty foods after training to replace sodium and throughout the day is really great. So again, thinking about things like pretzels, soup, salted trail mix and whatnot can all be really great options for replacing that sodium that's going to be lost in their sweat. Thinking about something outside of just beverage, how else can we hydrate? We talked about how a lot can come from food as well. So thinking about high water content foods, things, fruits like oranges, apples, different melons, pineapples, really high water content fruits. Same with vegetables, things like cucumbers, lettuce, celery, zucchini, peppers, tomatoes, and again, back to soups and broths. So we don't have to only get it from beverages. It can come from food sources as well. Drinks that you can make that are outside of your typical thinking, things like smoothies, shakes, fruit juice, again, milk, tea, are all going to contribute to your hydration intake. So advocating for intake of any of those items. Daily guidelines I like to kind of give athletes too that make it super simple and easy. Again, reminding them hydration is a 24/7 job, of course, during training, especially critical, but also a 24/7 job to be doing consistently. Generally, rule of thumb, drink your body weight in ounces. So, example, 150-pound athlete, 150 fluid ounces. Keep it nice and simple and easy. Also, there's the morning hydration check called WHAT that we like to use. So it stands for weight, urine, and thirst. So it's possible dehydration if you're seeing two of these weights. We want to ensure we're maintaining a stable weight within usually about a pound or two in the morning. If you're seeing more than that, there's a good chance you're probably pretty severely dehydrated. Urine, again, using that colored chart, dark and first thing in the morning might also show signs of dehydration and thirst. And if you wake up in the morning with a dry mouth or you're really craving fluids, you're really thirsty, that could also be a sign of dehydration. Lastly, here, I know you guys were provided with an awesome sports nutrition manual for high school athletes. So definitely reference that. There are a couple pages, page 13 and 14 in there, going over hydration, some tips, tricks, some of the stuff we talked about today. So definitely reference that. It's a great resource. I've also thrown my email on here. If you need anything, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. But hopefully that was helpful. Got a couple tips you could take away. And let me know if you have any further questions.